Hi everybody, I'm Eric. I'm going to be giving a video on how to do localization in Unreal Engine 4.18 and further, and probably 4.15 and on, using the localization dashboard. And this is going to be in the context of creating a real-world application rather than just a demonstration on how to get this working. My most useful sources was UE School at this YouTube link right here. This was about a 30-minute video produced by a German guy, and this was a great introduction on how to do localization, but he was missing a few steps, and this is going to be something that expands further on that. The UE4 documentation had a pretty good overview on how the localization works on the back end, but it doesn't really give you an understanding on how to actually implement it. So let's dive right in. I'll bring up my notes right here, so if you want to pause the video and look through any of this, feel free. So I am using a source build of Unreal Engine 4.18.3 and using Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition. I downloaded the source build off of GitHub and I compiled it. I highly recommend that you do that, because one of the things I do is I modify the engine to make the localization dashboard easier to use, and I will show you where to make that mod and how to or what it does. So actually, let me back up. I'll give you a demo of the project first so you can see what the output looks like. So here's the application. It's loading. So I currently have it running in Russian. If I wanted to switch to a different language, I just push F1, and then that brings me to a language selection screen. And I decided to have different flags and the English and the localized version of that text underneath it. So this seems to be pretty intuitive. So if you wanted to, you could say pick Spanish. You click on that, it loads, and then you go into the game again, and now you have the Spanish text down on the bottom. And you can switch to different languages if you want. So I'll go back to English. And there you go. So that's kind of what we're looking for with our localization solution. The other thing that I have going on here is when you select a language, I actually save that to disk, and then the next time you start the application, it pulls that saved language and sets that as the active language within the application. That way you don't have to go through and reconfigure the application every time you run it. And this is really helpful for people who run the application over and over again but don't want to reconfigure it each time. So I'll show you how to do that as well. Anyway, so let me talk a little bit about this project first. So this is a project that I did for Dell Computers to highlight their legacy of good philanthropic programs. And initially when I built this, there was no talk or intention of adding in localization support for international languages. So when I designed and built this, that was not even on my radar. After I built the app and I sent it off to them, they were very happy with it and they wanted to run with it and go international. So they wanted to support 12 different languages. So that turned into quite a bit of work, and I believe we have something like 25 different videos, each one about 2 minutes in length, and each one needed to have localized subtitles. So the key here is to make sure that it is done correctly and to have it very well organized. Otherwise, it could turn into a huge mess. So, to do it right, I spent a lot of time planning and figuring out the best way to do it, and I will show that. So, the first thing to note is that the localization is kind of an experimental feature within Unreal Engine. So to activate that, you go into Edit, Editor Preferences, look for this Experimental tab right here, and then the Localization Dashboard is underneath the Tools. It should be on the first one, and by default, it is not checked. Once you check that, Unreal Engine will ask you to restart, and then it will be enabled. When you run the application or Unreal Engine, after you restart, the experimental localization dashboard will be enabled, and then you can pop that up. Okay. So how do I explain the organization here? Let's talk about the localization dashboard and then go back and talk about the organization first. So when you open up the localization dashboard, you've got this targets tab and a game tab. And this game tab is going to just be based off of this target. If you add new targets, then you're going to get additional tabs. By default, it's just going to have game, and you don't need to really worry about this. So if you click on the game tab, then you'll see all this stuff that's necessary for localizing for that game. So basically the way this works is you gather all the text and content from within your game, and then that creates like this localization, I don't really know what to call it. It's like a UI that lets you localize. So you go to this gather from packages, and you create an include path that has your content directory with a wildcard at the end of it, that little star. And then you also want to have UMap and UAsset, so it scans your maps for blueprints or level blueprints, and then your UAssets for any text that needs to be localized. And once you have all this stuff, you click on this button, which will gather text, and that will go through every single folder and subfolder and asset within your project and look for anything that might need to be localized. And then it will compile a kind of a repository of everything that needs to be localized, and then you can start translating away. So if I click on this gather text, this wizard comes up, and it's going to spend about a minute to maybe a minute and a half searching through the whole entire project for text. I'm going to hit cancel though, I'm not going to wait. After that's done, you'll see your English will have a word count with the number of words that you have in your project, and you won't have any of these other cultures. So since I had 12 different languages that I needed to support in addition to English, I had to add in each of these cultures using this button right here. Pretty much all you do is click right here and then search for the languages that you're going to be adding support for. And then after you add that in, then you're going to see like this whole list of different cultures here. Then if you click on oh wait, one other thing to note is that English is my native language, so everything else is going to be relative to English. So when you're like localizing to Finnish, you're going to have English translations on one side and Finnish equivalents on the other. So if you click on Edit Translations, you'll get this, you'll get this untranslated tab, a needs review tab, and a completed tab. If you have not done any translations, you'll see the whole entire list of all the untranslated text, and then you'll see a column with stuff that's just waiting to be translated. Once you've completed it, and then reloaded this, then you'll see all the translated stuff. Oh, that's interesting. That's weird. This should all be in Finnish. Oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the English version. Of course, translating English to English is always going to be English. No translation required. So, if you did click on this gather text, and then you looked at your translated stuff here, you won't have this column right here. That's I modded the engine to add that in, but if you look at any of the entries here, and you look down here at this key and then the context, you should see probably some sort of a GUID of some sort that corresponds to a blueprint or wherever it's pulling that text from. So the way I decided to organize this is that everything that could possibly be user-facing and that needs to be localized is going to sit inside of my asset string table. This is let me show you how to create one of these. So you just right-click in here, and then you go to miscellaneous, and then string table. And then when you open that up, it's going to be completely empty, and it will have a namespace. And the best way to organize the namespaces is to kind of like think of the best way that you want to organize the content within your game. And it's going to be different from project to project, but I would go by map or by episode and just use whatever makes the most sense. The way you can think of a string table is kind of as a dictionary where you have a lookup key and then a source key. So the lookup key needs to be something that makes sense, and then the source string is going to be your English text or untranslated text that's going to be native to the application. So if I wanted to create a key, I could go something like Ocean Plastics scene 1 line 1, and then I can add in my text, and once I hit the add button, it will pop up here. So I did this for every single video in my project and every single piece of text that shows up, and I've got a whole bunch of different entries here, and this is kind of what it looks like. It was very important to have this very well organized, otherwise I would not know what anything means, and it was especially important to have the keys sorted in a meaningful order. So the way I set it up is the very first piece is kind of like the section that the video belongs to, and then the second section is the video ID. So in this case it's hotspot 01, and then the very last number is going to be the line number within that video. It's kind of like the subtitle ID. And altogether this is a unique identifier that kind of makes sense if you look at it. And then here is the text that it's equivalent to. So for the ocean plastics category, I have 3 different hotspots. So hotspot 1, hotspot 2, and hotspot 3, and each of these has a different number of lines. I start off my numbering with 01 instead of 1, because if you have 10 lines, then line number 10 will be sorted improperly. So after you populate your string table with all the different strings within your application, you can go back into your localization dashboard and gather text. And you can gather text as many times as you want. It's not going to affect anything. And my best practice is to actually go into the translations afterwards and then look at where all the text is coming from. So you can see up here I've got keys that have a GUID and a source string and a translation string, and generally if you see a GUID up here, that means that this string needs to be removed from wherever it's located and moved into the string table so that it can actually be translated. If you need to know where it lives, you can just click on this key right here, and then you can look at this context down here, and you can see this is going to be in my game folder, blueprints. This is going to be under the Slate language selection map, and then under the hide and load function. So if I actually wanted to localize that, that's where I could find it. So I would just go through each one of these different sections, find that piece of text, and then copy and paste it into the string table, and then delete it from the source. And then ideally you have no pieces of user-facing strings anywhere else but inside your string table. And the reason you want to do this is because it creates a central repository for everything that needs to be localized. You can think that if you handed this over to the translator, anything in there gets translated, anything missing does not get translated. Okay, let's see, where are we next? So we filled in our string table with keys, and then we added in the cultures that we want to support. What's this? Enable the gather from packages. Oh, yeah, we already did that. Our default language is English. We gathered the text. We talked about how everything should be exclusively inside of the string table. So let's talk about modifying the engine and why we want to do that. So in terms of workflow, the way this worked is somebody went through and transcribed every single video into text, and then they sent that text off to Dell, and then Dell subcontracted out a translation services company, and then they sent back a whole bunch of different localized translations for each video in each different language. So for example, we got Portuguese, and these are all the different categories. So if we open up the ocean plastics, this is what I received. So I don't read Portuguese. I imagine most of you don't either, but if you do read Portuguese, pretend this is a different language that you don't read, and somehow what we need to do is we need to match this translation to the English version. The way I approached this was to use periods as kind of like an identifying marker to symbolize a sentence. So this sentence would be matched to the first sentence in the introduction. This sentence would be matched. There's a period right there. This sentence would be matched to the first sentence, and so on and so forth. And generally this works pretty well, but I did discover that the Thai language does not have any punctuation whatsoever. So if I was going to be separating out sentences between a punctuation, then I would be in some real trouble if I looked at the Thai version. So I'll give you a demonstration of that here. So here, I don't know where one sentence begins and the next one ends, so I can't really copy and paste one sentence because I can't read it. So I ended up having to have this go sent back to the translators and have that broken off into sentence by sentence. Now, ideally, what you want to do is take your string table and take these keys and the corresponding sentence and send each of these off and have them translated one by one. That way, you don't have to be parsing paragraphs and trying to make a best guess on where one sentence begins and the next one ends. So in order to do the translations, let's say you've added in each of these cultures, you'll want to go into this Edit Translations button right here. Let's click this. And by default, what you'll see is the untranslated tab with the source sentence and something that's just waiting for a translation. And then you can type in the translation or copy and paste the translation in here. And then if you close it and then open it up again, you'll see that your translation moved from the untranslated tab into the completed tab. And it should look something like this. Now, the thing that's really annoying is the way that all this stuff is sorted. So it's sorted by the source, or the text itself, rather than the key. And if you're trying to go through a whole bunch of paragraphs and add in line by line the translations, your paragraph order will not match the order of your English sentences here. So unless you can actually read and understand Thai, you're not going to know what version or what sentence matches what sentence here. So what I ended up doing is I modified the source engine, or the source code within the engine, to display the keys that I created inside of my string table. And then if I click on the key, then it will sort the strings, and then I can go through in sequential order and say, okay, this sentence matches line 1 in the paragraph. This is line 2 in the paragraph, line 3 in the paragraph. But if it's sorted by source, then you're going to have some major trouble. So to do this modification, you just open up the engine. You go into the UE4 section of the project, and it's going to be stored inside of the editor. So you open up the editor section, and you scroll down, and then it's going to be within the translation editor. This is the localization dashboard that we enabled. And then if you expand all this stuff out, you'll see all the different components that make up the translation editor. And I believe I already had it open, but the piece that you're looking for is translationeditor.cpp. And then all you need to do is add in this. Oh, let me back up. So this is the untranslated tab right here. This is the review tab, and then this is the completed tab. And that corresponds to this tab, and this tab, right? So what we wanted to do is add a key tab, or a key column, so that we could sort by that. And by default, this is not inside the engine, so you can just copy and paste this onto each of these corresponding lines, like so. And then when you recompile the engine, you should see these tabs, or not tabs, but columns that you can sort by. And this will make your life 100 times easier when you're trying to do translations. I don't think any of this other stuff matters. Okay. The other thing to consider is that fonts may not necessarily support all the characters in the language that you're importing, right? So I found that the default font in Unreal, which is the Roboto font, supports every language except for Thai. So if you look at the Thai language, I don't want the English one. So if you look at the Thai version, you've got, let's sort by key here. You've got the text here, and then you've also got all these funky symbols. And this is all in UTF-8, which means that even though you might copy and paste the text into this translation section, it may not display correctly, but the data will still be in there correctly. So if you just have a different font that can actually display each of these glyphs, then it will still be correct. So I imported, I believe it was a Tahoma font, and if you click on this choose translation font, then I select the Tahoma, hit open, and the Tahoma font has the Thai symbols in it, so it can actually convert the UTF encodings into the correct glyphs, and then it show in Thai. But that's just for this localization dashboard, not your game itself. So every time you restart the editor, it's going to revert back to the default font, and you would have to re-enter or redo this workflow. If you wanted to display the Thai language within the editor, you're going to have to bring in a font that can actually support that. Let's see. So ftext is the best way to display text to the user. Anything that is user facing must be ftext. You don't want fnames or fstrings because those cannot be localized. So I will show you how the ftext works. I've got a blueprint that has a button that has a caption. So this caption text is ftext by default. So if you look right here, you've got this little drop down button right here for the ftext, and then you can either, I don't think you can actually create your own, no. So here's where that string table comes in super handy. So we're going to select this drop down menu and select the string table that we want to use. In this case, it's going to be the asset string table. And then we're going to look up the lookup ID for the string that we want to display. And then let's pick this one right here. And then it's going to populate this with the localized text value. Excuse me. So when you switch the language internally from English to whatever, this will automatically switch. You don't have to do it yourself, and this will save you so much time, especially when you have lots of text in lots of different languages. And this is kind of like the magic of UE4 localization. Another issue that we had is that initially all of our, or we had some graphics that had textures and text embedded within them, like this right here. So this is a texture that has supply chain, recycling, and reuse, and this was baked into the image. The problem with this is this works great for English, but if we're trying to localize this into different languages, then people who don't speak or read any English will not be able to read and interpret this and understand what it means. So what I ended up doing is creating an empty version like this, and then I can put in the localized string right here by rendering this to a texture. But I'll show you how to do that. So I did that within the button. In the begin play, I have the caption text, and this is a expose on spawn f text piece of information, and then I make sure that the length is at least greater than 0. If it is, then I want to create a canvas render target. This is like creating a layer in Photoshop, and then when we want to update this layer, what I want to do is I want to composite the localized text on top of that layer. So the first thing I do is I create a texture based off of the inputted texture, and then I take the caption text and then I use the draw text component, or not really a component but node. Then I draw that text using my render font, and I set where on that image I want it, and then you can pretty much just look at all the settings I have right here. One thing I noted is that in images like this, where you have supply chain, recycling, and reuse, within the string table, this is going to be a single string with no line breaks, I believe. Let's see, where did it go? Oh, I did put in a character return. So normally this would be on one line, but I put in a character return right here so that it's on 2 lines. And the reason I do that is because if it's all on one line, then this text will just wrap right off the edge of this texture. So if I put it on 2 lines, then it will actually display the whole entire text within this region instead of wrapping off. And this is actually a pretty big consideration for multiple languages as well, because some languages use more characters to display the same thing than other languages. So when you're doing your testing, you need to verify that it displays the whole entire sentence in every language on your assets. Otherwise it won't be readable, and it just gets truncated. So that's kind of what I'm doing right here. I'm splitting the string based off of the character return, and if I have 2 strings, then I just render both of them sequentially, and then I just change the Y offset. So let's say you've gone through your localization dashboard and you have imported the translations for every single language. After you've imported them, then you hit this compile text button, and that will actually take all your assets and create like this manifest on the back end. Let me show you what that looks like. Now, you don't necessarily need to know this, but it's handy to know if you ever are curious or need to do some debugging or troubleshooting. So this is the root folder of my project. If you go into the content folder, you'll see this localization folder right here, and then you'll see game. This is the target that we have. See this guy right here? If you open that up, then that will show you every single language that you're supporting, and these are going to be the ISO display names for those supported languages, right? So English is EN, Spanish or España is ES, Finnish is FI, and then Portuguese BR is Brazilian Portuguese, so this is like the parent culture, and then this is the subculture, sort of. And then this would be like simplified Chinese, but you could have other versions of Chinese like Cantonese and Mandarin, etc. You're going to have this game.locmeta, or localized meta information. Let's open this up in Notepad. And it has a whole bunch of stuff that we don't care about, right? Let's look at game.manifest. So this contains pretty much every single string table and kind of like all the data that gets displayed within the localization dashboard. So here's the namespace of asset string table. Then here's going to be a huge list of children, and the first one would be like a source string text blah 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 with the key that we created, and then the context path, and it's going to do that for pretty much everything. And then if we turn off word wrapping, then we can see what this actually looks like underneath the hood, right? So if you look at, let's say, the finished version, now we have, let's open this archive up. So here you have the source string in English, and that's because that's our default language. And then you have a translated version, and this is the finished version. And then you also have the key that corresponds to it. And all this stuff is pretty much displayed right here as well. Oops, that is not the folder. Neither is that. Oh, come on. So you can kind of make the connection on how this backend data is matched to the localization dashboard. All right, let's talk about how to actually switch the languages and stuff. So to do this, you're going to have to open up Visual Studio and go into your project. I decided that I would set the active language within my game mode. So if I go into my game mode.h, I have an enumeration with the selected language. If I select this, hit F12, then this shows you all the different languages that I have. And this is a pretty good practice that the UE Schools YouTube video suggested, and I find it works pretty nicely. That makes it a lot more human readable. And then the other thing that I have is save game information and loading game information, and I'm not really going to go into the details on how to implement that, but basically within the game mode I have two functions for save game state and load game state. I have the save version and the build version of the files, so if there's any project updates, I can determine which version of the application the save game file is for. One other super important note. Within the U property, I have the save game attribute set for all the stuff that I want to be saved. And then here's the actual implementation. So I have my binary data block, my memory writer that pulls in that binary data block is something to write to. here's my save game archive. I serialize all the data, and then I add in the selected language to that serialized data, and then I create my save game file, my player profile, and then I set the save game file's data to this binary data that I have, or that contains all my save game data. Then I set my name, and then I actually call the save on it. So this actually writes all the data to the save game. And likewise with the load game, I already know what all this stuff is, so I'm just going to be setting all that here. Check to make sure that it's correctly loaded. Then I read in the binary data from the load file, and then I parse it here, and then I pull out the selected language, and after I have loaded all the data that's in the load file, or the save game file, is loaded back into my game mode class. This lets me have persistence between game sessions, so you don't have to continuously reload or reconfigure your application. Okay. So I have 3 different levels. The first one is the main level. This is the one that we're currently looking at, and this is where you would actually be going through the application experience. I also have a language selection level. I'll open that up. I don't need to save any of that. And this one is pretty straightforward. If we open up the level blueprint, basically all we're doing is, let's see, we have a begin play. We want to show the mouse cursor. We're going to get the game mode, try to cast that to our own custom game mode, and then we're going to be loading the game state, the guy that we have right here, right? And then we're going to be creating our user interface widget, storing that, adding that to the viewport, and then we're going to be pulling the selected language that we loaded and setting that into the current language. And then within this user interface widget, we're also going to be setting the currently selected language. In terms of the language selection UI, I'll pull that up. It's pretty straightforward. I just have a whole bunch of buttons with flag images on top. If you look at the graph, let's see. So right when we start the blueprint, we have the game mode, and then we are going to be updating the currently displayed subtitle, or never mind. So here's how you select different languages. We're just going to have this function that passes in the new language, and then we're going to set the internal language to that newly set language, and this is going to be returning a true or false depending on whether it worked or not. And then we're going to be setting the language within the UI so that we can update that, and then we're going to hide everything, and then we're going to be saving that to the disk, which is what this section does, and then we're going to be opening the main level. So the key thing to note here is that when you change the selected language within your application, that change does not actually happen until you actually transition to another level. I don't know if any other people have gotten it to work without the level transitions, but that's just been my experience. Most of this stuff is just UI stuff, so I don't think I'm going to really spend a lot of time going over any of that. Yeah. So once you've got the UI built and all the logic wired in, If you wanted to test this within Unreal Engine, you can't really run it with the play in editor window, because that's just not going to work correctly. I'll give you a demonstration. So currently it's set to English. If I wanted to switch to Portuguese, I click on that, it loads to the next map, which means it's activating Portuguese. Now you'll notice that despite being switched to Portuguese, the text is still displayed in English. And that's just because we're using play in editor. You'll also notice that up on the very top of the window, the text up here actually switched into Portuguese. So we actually changed the Unreal Engine language to Portuguese, but not the application language. Now if you go back and you look at the editor now, it's all in Portuguese. Now if I run this again, click on the Portuguese, it loads, still in English, right? So in your testing workflow, do not use the play in editor window. Instead, what you want to do is select the standalone game. Okay, so we hit that, no save. Now it's pulling the save game file to figure out what language we had selected last. It has Portuguese highlighted because that was the last language we selected. Let's just select Spanish. Now it loads, transitions to the next level. Now it's streaming in the level data, and it's still loading. You can see the little icon in the lower right hand corner as it's loading. Come on. And now it's in Spanish. So you can see that you want to test your localization with the standalone version rather than the play in editor version. And if you don't, then you're going to be pulling your hair out. Okay. So with that in mind, that the language selection happens when you transition to another level, the question is, how do you get the persistent language stuff to actually work when you launch the game from like a packaged build, right? So the solution I came up with is I have 3 different levels. So the main one is the one that's actually got all the content in it. The language selection is the one with the flags that you click on, and this one will transition you into the main level. I also have a start level, and the whole entire purpose of this is just to read the save game file, set that as the current language, and then instantly transition the player into the main level. I'll show you what that looks like really quick. So within the start level, I just have the begin play. I create a loading window, and it's hard to read all this because the engine switched to Spanish, but we get the game mode, set that to the game mode, load the game state, set the language to the loaded language, and then transition to the new level. And that's pretty much it. Very simple. So the last bit, the part that's, I should probably switch this to English so that we can actually see what this is. do it in Pi. Yeah, now it switched the editor back into English. Okay. So the last piece is actually packaging the game to support the localization that we built. So what you do is you go into Edit, Project Settings. There's two pieces that you need to look at. The first one is the maps and the modes. I set the default map to the start map. That's this guy right here, and this just loads the data and kicks us into, or loads the currently saved culture and then kicks us into the main. And then, oh shoot, too many tabs up here. And then the other one that you want to look at is your packaging. So by default, let's see, by default, you're going to have this window right here. And the localization stuff is going to be hidden underneath this advanced tab. And then what you want to do is you want to look at each of these languages or cultures that you're supporting, and then check off the ones that you're supporting. So by default, it's just going to show everything that Unreal Engine has the capability of supporting. Then if you click on this show localized, then that's going to show only the languages that you support via the localization dashboard. And then I just went through and checked all of these. Okay, so it looks like I have more than the 12 languages that I support, but I'm just supporting all the subcultures within each of the 12 languages. So English, Cameroon, etc., etc. And then the super, super important piece that I spent about 2 hours trying to figure out and I didn't know is this internationalization support piece right here. By default, it is set to English. And what you want, especially if you're supporting 12 different languages, is to have the all cultures supported. So this kind of like tells the packager, I guess, what languages you're supporting so that it can build out, I guess, the manifest or something. So this one would be like, okay, I'm supporting English, French, Italian, German, Spanish, English, French, Italian, German, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And if you have a language that you're supporting that is not any of these four, then somebody can't switch to that localized version. So you definitely want to have it set to all. Then after you have done that, you go to File, Package Project, Windows, Windows 64-bit or whatever platform you're deploying to. Click on that, and it's going to ask you where you want to package to. I'm not actually going to do it, but after you're done, if you've done everything correctly, then you will get a binary that looks like this. And then just to demonstrate again, you just open this up. This will start me in the start map, which is just a black map that kicks me off to the main after it sets the language. And then I will have the language. Now if I push F1, it will transfer me back to the language selection screen. So if I select Spanish, it will send me to the main menu again, or the main map, but with the Spanish settings. And then if you look at I'm not really sure what to call this, the main menu, you can see the Spanish has the localized text rendered onto the images. And then if you wanted to, let's see.
Imagine being a school principal, trying to decide between powering a school or running a computer lab because of an expensive and unreliable
But yeah, that's how it works. Let's see if I missed anything. I think I covered everything. So, thanks for watching. I guess if you have any trouble or questions or discover something else, please leave a comment, and thanks. Good luck.